Hi everyone. Thanks for coming along this evening. So, as you just heard, I'm head of exhibitions at Dundee Contemporary Arts, and that's just across the road for anyone who hasn't visited yet. We're a publicly funded cross-art form institution in the city here, really the kind of centre for contemporary art in Dundee. And I've been in the role for just over 2.5 years now, and in that time have been working with the team to shift the gallery programme in certain ways to make space for voices that have been overlooked or in many cases willfully erased by the dominant culture to date. We're a public space, therefore a political space, and therefore have a responsibility, as I understand it, to resist and try and work against the multitude of repressive and discriminatory frameworks that allow things like racism, classism, misogyny, ableism, transphobia, and homophobia to thrive in public. When I use a term like dominant culture, I really mean these frameworks. And if we're to resist these frameworks, if we're to resist this dominant culture, which is to say capitalism, which is to say patriarchy, which is to say, for example, the current Tory government, we have to create space to wallow in all of the things that culture fears. And to my mind, those are things like empathy, vulnerability, closeness, togetherness, intimacy, pleasure, and perhaps something that encompasses all of these things, love. So a question that I've been working through in my practice for some time centres on an idea of resistance through love. Is it possible to work with a productive conception of love as an artistic, perhaps a curatorial, and also political methodology? Can I champion artists in my work who are pushing forward these kinds of conceptions of love in their own work? This proposes a means of working really that I'm stepping off from the radical work of the writer Bell Hooks and her conception of love as an action, not just a feeling. If love is an action, there is intent, there is responsibility, and there is accountability within it. And in that, it can be used as a catalyst for change and not just a passive state. Bell Hooks puts forward an idea of love comprising of a combination of 6 ingredients, if you like, being care, commitment, knowledge, responsibility, respect, and trust. So I'm trying to kind of mix these ingredients into my curatorial work, into the support that I'm able to offer artists, and into the exhibitions and projects that I might want to bring into the world. I'm asking myself, in what way does the action that I am taking or the work that I'm doing reflect these values or traits? And I'm thinking of a question of love here as a question of what to do and how to do it. And in this questioning, you kind of find a sense of love that is active, in no way passive, that is engaged, that is political, that is inherently feminist, and also wonderfully queer in many ways. Bell Hooks, in her work, really calls out the extent to which we have become cynical about love, about talking about it. And she rightly outlines a pervasive loneliness that is deeply felt at the moment, particularly by the most precarious and by the most disenfranchised bodies in our communities, under capitalism and under patriarchy. And so we're trying to make space in DCA to make this kind of expansive and in many ways radical conception of love felt in different ways in the programme over the past year or so. Through American filmmaker Margaret Salmon and her exhibition Whole from earlier this year, where we held space for a gorgeous and expansive exploration of physical love and touch in the galleries, with 60mm film works documenting, in the manner of cinema verite, different couples, very different genders, very different bodies engaged in physical acts of lovemaking, making public and celebrating in public intimate private moments of pleasure and connection, very often in non-normative capacities as we would typically see these acts in public up to now. Through British artist Patrick Staff's exhibition over the summer, that put love to work to tend to complex questions of gender, of control, of law and the state. This was a project that centred on trans and non-binary positions, speaking on how history, technology, capitalism and the law have fundamentally changed our idea or our conception of the social constitution of bodies in the world. It spoke to how we need to abolish feelings of guilt and shame that are so often caught up in queer or non-normative desire, and how a political articulation of death and an understanding of the political power of death can help us construct loving, meaningful modes of grieving that fight for the living just as much as honouring the dead. Through Alberta Whittle's exhibition, Alberta is an incredible Barbadian Scottish artist, and her project that we just closed a week or two ago, called How Flexible Can We Make the Mouth, actively spoke of radical love and kinship that resists particularly racism, that works to unseat so-called historical facts that have always been written and recorded by privileged white men, and call forth and connect with more ancient and informal ways of understanding or conceiving of the past. Alberta uses love to cut through the violence of colonial thought and structures, to create space that fostered healing and an idea of healing through self-liberation. Within her work, Alberta uses love to imagine better futures. And the writer, Professor Christina Sharp, said in a brilliant essay that she wrote for us as part of the project, to make us, Alberta is trying to make us see and hear and feel things that we do not yet have. And this idea of imagining a future, or radically imagining a future, leads me on to our current exhibition, or rather our upcoming exhibition, that I'm co-curating with a dear friend and colleague, Kim McAleese. And this will be a major group show launching on the 13th of December, inspired by the writings of American writer Ursula K Le Guin. And Le Guin was a remarkable person, writer and poet, known most of all for her spearheading of feminist science fiction writing across the second half of the 20th century. And we're attempting to draw together a community or new kind of constellation of voices over the winter in Dundee to explore some of the contemporary relevance of her writings. Ursula's work constantly hints at new ways for us to think about how we might articulate our intentions when it comes to cultural production, particularly, and really tenderly instructs us to use our imagination productively in order to hold space for other voices with care and compassion, whether within the architecture of a gallery or museum or between the pages of a book. The project that we are cooking up right now involves visual artists, but also writers, poets, musicians, and performers who are all engaged in this vital act of radical imagination, crafting alternative spaces that hint at ways in which we might all live and love better together. So that's a very swift overview of different acts of love taking place at DCA of late. Acts very much driven forward by brilliant artists and thinkers who are generously allowing me to learn from them as I work to support the realisation of their ideas in the galleries. And this kind of work, to my mind, is work of resistance and is political work and ought to be political work and is also importantly loving work. As long as we continue at DCA to maybe be supported loosely here and there in our thinking by Bell Hooks' 6 pillars of care, commitment, knowledge, responsibility, respect, and trust. And it's ongoing work. It's an ongoing process. We haven't answered any questions necessarily. I haven't answered a question in this presentation. But I suppose I'm not really interested in answers in the work that I'm doing. If anything, I'm trying to find ways of getting further and further into an inquiry of sorts, and enjoying that by having other artists and writers and art workers across different fields around me, helping me, who are similarly kind of committed to a deepening and an enrichment of a question. Perhaps in this case, a question of love. So, thank you.